It's always the succession of death, but thank you very much for coming out and sticking with us for the remainder of this session. My name is Jeff Riedel. I'm the Canadian co-chair of the Science Priority Committee, which makes up the half of the Science Advisory Board, together with the Research Coordinating Committee. And we're going to continue our session with our first speaker, Dave Allen, who's going to speak to fertilizer application in the Western Lake Erie Basin. David.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thank you to the Hardcore for being here. This is a project that involved a number of collaborators. So John Bratton of Limnotech headed up the contractor team that worked on it. Michael Murray and I, supported by Matthew Child, were the coordinators for the IJC. And we had a wonderful work group that worked really hard on this project, and of course the whole Limnotech team did as well. And a number of individuals provided this data. So all of that was a big help. The project has its really overarching goal was to compare commercial fertilizer and manure as different types of fertilizer and the management practices associated with them and potentially impacting algal populations in Western Lake Erie. But in addition to the sort of the number crunching on the fertilizer, when I say fertilizer from now on, it will be commercial fertilizer. In addition to the number crunching on fertilizer and manure use, we really wanted to look into nutrient management issues and how well monitoring and modeling can help us understand what the best nutrient management practices might be. And then just more broadly, what are the factors that are really likely to influence the nutrient loads that actually reach Lake Erie? And as an outcome, all the appropriate actions to restore the health of Lake Erie. So broadly, those were the project objectives. And what I'm first going to do is summarize the findings on commercial fertilizer application and then manure fertilizer application. And this chart, which was also shown by John Bratton in a presentation he gave yesterday, shows by watersheds the commercial fertilizer application that has occurred from roughly 1987 through 2012. And the data pretty clearly show that phosphorus application of commercial fertilizer has decreased markedly over the past several decades. And it's now more or less consistent. There have been no major changes in the past decade. There are a few locations that you can see on the map that are receiving higher application rates. And in the process of generating these data, there was a number of data and information challenges that we thought were appropriate to highlight. So that, for example, the type of commercial fertilizer, mono versus diammonium phosphate, for example, changes over time. That's a complicating factor. It's difficult to distinguish the amount of soil phosphorus or legacy phosphorus versus fertilizer that's driving crops. And information on farm practices is not available to the public at high resolution. I'll come back to this point later. This is really one of the key concerns we have, is it's difficult to really take this information down to a fine level. The data are county scale data, and then they're redistributed to watersheds, and at a finer scale, we simply don't have a good understanding of what's going on. Manure is estimated from animal populations, so it's an estimate of the amount of manure generated. And from this information combined with the previous information on commercial fertilizer, we can make the broad statement that the ratio of commercial fertilizer to manure in the US side is about 80-20. On the Canadian side, it's about 50-50. So there's a markedly different balance between the US and Canadian side of the basin. This manure generation estimate is from animal populations, and it's probably an overestimate of the amount of manure that's applied. It's probably primarily manure from feedlots that gets applied as fertilizer, and then manure from animals and pastures just stays where it lands, so to speak. It's mostly applied in the upper watersheds, and it hasn't changed much. There's been no major changes in manure production since the mid-1980s. Again, data challenges, information challenges. It's really difficult to get information on the amount of manure applied in the specific locations. So there's real potential for hotspots because presumably most of this material doesn't go very far, and some of it can be some of these CAFOs, permitted animal feeding facilities, can be quite close to river margins. So there is the real potential for some of this material to make its way into waterways at a higher rate that we can't really quantify. And then even the information on the number of animals is less certain in terms of spatial distribution because only the larger animal feeding operations are permitted and the smaller ones, we would not know the exact location of those animals. So when you put this information together and turn to one of the key questions of our project, the magnitude of commercial fertilizer use and manure generation and use, this table sums it up. It's about, it's already said, 80% to 20%, 80% commercial fertilizer in the US, about 50-50 in Canada, and that's about a 70-30 split for the basin as a whole. These data are older data, 2006, 2007, because at the time of the report completion, that was the last available comparable data. Limnotech is in the process of updating these to 2011, 2012, so we'll see. There might be some changes. But when you come to the question of, excuse me, can we use this to assess the relative importance of commercial fertilizer P versus manure P reaching the lake from river export? We can't. There is no analytical techniques that can distinguish where that phosphorus came from in a water sample at the mouth of a river. There are methods underway, and those methods may potentially give us the ability to do this in the future using stable isotopes or molecular fingerprinting. But at this time, that method really is not available to us. And probably the only way to get a better handle on this is through continued field-based monitoring where we have comparable fields with different fertilizer applied to them. So local scale field-based monitoring may be the best way to get at this question in the near term. Another source of information we looked at is what's called the crop P balance over time, and this is simply the difference between the amount of P that's added as any form of fertilizer and the amount of P that's removed in harvested crops. This chart, which is at state and province level averaging, shows a really, I think, important and interesting story, which is over time, the amount of P applied as fertilizer has substantially exceeded the amount of P removed as harvested crops until roughly the mid-1990s. And then they came to something close to parity. This implies that at least in the past, there's been the potential for accumulation of P in the soil. Pam Josie gave an interesting talk yesterday afternoon where they're looking at this accumulation of the P imbalance as a way of understanding soil test phosphorus levels. But in recent years, this has clearly changed. This is a dramatic change. So the amount of P removed as harvested crop is pretty much in balance. Two important caveats. Well, one supporting piece of evidence. There's also supporting evidence that soil P levels have declined, at least in some locations. So it implies a drawdown of soil P as the amount of fertilizer being applied is lessened. But two caveats to that. All these data are averaged over coarse spatial scale, so potential local imbalances could be very important. And the other caveat is the total flux of P added or P removed is large relative to river P export. So something like 1 or 2% if you look at the amount of phosphorus exported in rivers, it's in the order of 1 or 2% of the amount of phosphorus applied as fertilizer. So you could have a very small amount of leakage and it would still be important. So we have to keep that in mind. Well, as a number of researchers have shown, P loads to the lake haven't really changed very much. Total P loads have changed little. Flow-weighted concentrations of total phosphorus have declined slightly, but this is offset by increasing discharge, which is why the loads have not changed. And the factor that's looked to by so many is that dissolved reactive phosphorus has increased as a fraction of total phosphorus. So at the same time that we see something close to balance of fertilizer applied and crop removed, we're not seeing any substantial decline in phosphorus loads, and we're seeing a rise in dissolved reactive phosphorus. And of course, we're seeing algal blooms. And so putting this together in our report project, we really felt that we wanted to look beyond just the fertilizer numbers to try to get a handle on what additional factors might be going on that would be responsible for P export and the algal response. What's the effectiveness of BMPs, of best management practices, and what's the capability of monitoring and modeling to help us better understand what's really going on here. So in our report, we looked at quite a number of additional factors, and I don't really have the time to describe them in full detail here. There's a large literature that's looking at how changes in tillage practices, the proliferation of tile drains, the role of climate change, the potential role of stored phosphorus or legacy phosphorus, and other factors may all be playing a role. And so I'm just going to highlight a few of these that we felt were particularly important for further understanding and further research. So there's been a major change in tillage. The shift to conservation tillage, no-till practices became really widespread after the 1990s. And this means that they're no longer tilling the soil and pushing applied phosphorus deeper into the soil, so there's a tendency for applied phosphorus to sit at the surface layers. In addition, without tillage, the roots of plants, the roots of corn, for example, will continue to stay in place, and then as they rot out, they make basically macropores, which can be transport pathways to take water and any dissolved materials downward. And where they can encounter drain tiles. So there's evidence from the soil test phosphorus data that phosphorus is increasing on the soil surface. And it's interacting, these are really two interacting factors with the extent of tile drainage networks, which can in some instances result in the transport of up to 50% of the runoff from fields going through subsurface drain tiles. And so all of these ideas basically connect together. There's a really emerging consensus that dissolved reactive phosphorus is the primary concern, that it's being transported through tiles, that it's being influenced by these changes in tillage practices. And whether the BMPs are sufficient to deal with this changing agricultural setting, this changing agricultural situation, is simply uncertain. The 4 Rs are very good ideas that are getting a lot of investigation, but it's early days in knowing how effective they're going to be. And then we have to acknowledge climate change is an important factor. Increased rainfall and increased discharge are documented for the Maumee by Craig Stowe's work. That increase in discharge is why total phosphorus loads have not declined, even though flow-weighted concentrations have declined somewhat. And it's estimated that about 1/3 of the increase in dissolved reactive phosphorus is simply greater runoff. The other 2/3 has to do with the other factors on this page. So there's actually still a lot of uncertainty to manage this problem well. Monitoring and modeling was another aspect that we investigated, and I wanted to talk about them together because what became certainly more clear to me in the course of working on this report was how important the linkage between monitoring and modeling are. Monitoring data are what allow us to diagnose problems, track improvements, and calibrate models. And models are what allow us to simulate future outcomes of management interventions. So we really need those working together. SWOT has been widely used and has been particularly helpful in coming up with a better understanding of how nutrient runoff varies with certain drivers and the effectiveness of different management strategies. We're fortunate in Western Lake Erie that we have very good monitoring data from the Heidelberg lab, and we have some very excellent modelers working with these data. And so we have actually a much better handle on what we think some of these problems and their solutions are. And in general, that work tells us that it's going to take a mix of a number of strategies to meet the P targets that we hope to achieve. So we had a number of recommendations, and I think I'm going to have to speed up just a little bit here. As good as the monitoring network is, we think that it can be improved, and that we think it really needs stable funding. It exists because of the people who are involved in this monitoring, cobbling together funds from different sources over years, and we're just very fortunate that they've been able to do that. So we really need to integrate the monitoring work and the monitoring networks. And we also need much higher resolution information on farm practices than we currently have to be able to do a better job than we are at present. So these are really steps for the way forward. And then research quality models at various scales, again, getting down to finer scales, can really help us improve our understanding and see how different alternative management scenarios can work in the future. So in closing, while we set out to look at the relative importance of commercial fertilizer versus manure, we really came to the view that the main focus needs to be on management practices, and that how the fertilizer is applied, the type of is probably more important than the type of fertilizer used. And so this is where the management practices are really seem to be key. We support the view of the modelers that it's going to require a broad implementation of a mix of existing BMPs to reduce phosphorus loads. And then we think we probably need to go beyond the existing BMPs. And this is, again, research development need to better understand the interaction between no-till or conservation tillage, between tiling practices, and between other farming innovations to better manage edge-of-field phosphorus loss. So it's likely that we'll actually need to see new management practices developed, and there's some indications in this direction. So with that, it was a wonderful project to work on with my colleagues. Thanks to the IJC for the support, and thanks to all of you for being here.
done some soil testing and found that the soil tests, after a few years, the soil tests where they've been abandoned for a few years will be about at least double, if not higher, than for the rest of the non-banded area. And I guess, do you think there would be an opportunity there to say, okay, are we looking at soil tests wrong and then we'll look at it over the entire year? Should we really be focusing the recommendations on, say, that 2 inches within that root zone?
I don't know the answer to that. That's maybe someone else in the audience can help, but that's pretty technical aspect of farm application.
Maybe one more question.
Did the research group or the advisory board discuss at all when you're talking about needing information at a higher resolution and finer scale on practices, how we can collect that while still protecting farmers' privacy and you know, their personal information?
So I think that's a great question, and we recognize the difficulty because that information at the finer scale is proprietary. It has profound implications, and I wanted to mention that, for example, when you run a swap model and you look at the benefits of adding certain amounts of DMT, you're essentially assuming there's none there now, and it may actually be close to maxed out. So you don't really know what the potential is to add more DMTs at a certain time. And so I have a personal speculation. I think that that's a question that should be addressed as if we can find an answer. And I look for a parallel with people who do research in medical areas where they're working with highly confidential patient information, and they do so in a very restricted, computer environment with computers that are not networked to others, and they're all vetted personnel. So if it was difficult to share the information with everyone, it seems to me there ought to be mechanisms to share the information in a limited way where it can really benefit the modeling activity and the understanding. And so I think if there was an opportunity to have a conversation and say, can we find a compromise, protecting privacy, that maybe it could be done.
Dave, I think we should end it there. Thank you again. So moving on, I'd like to introduce the next speaker, who's, the co-chair of the Research Coordinating Committee, Debbie Lee, who's going to speak on modeling approaches to effective ecosystem management.
So thank you for staying to attend the final session of today. I admire your endurance. I hope you had a great week, and I hope you can take home a lot of things from this week. This IJC Science Advisory Board Research Coordination Committee project arose out of the recognition that addressing the Western Lake Erie harmful algal bloom problem by setting targets to reduce phosphorus loads is actually a grand experiment on a large ecosystem scale. To approach this experiment from a scientific perspective, a monitoring, modeling, and adaptive management framework is required. In addition, a structured institutional framework that currently Annex 4 is working to define is necessary. So my talk today will focus only on the modeling framework of that aspect. I'd like to recognize my co-authors, Gavin Christie, who's the Canadian co-chair of the IJC RCC and head of research at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and also Dr. George Arondites, who's, as you know, is the department chair and our host for this week. Today I'll cover the rationale of the project, the study process and deliverables, our progress to date, major findings, and next steps. So adaptive management is a structured, iterative process for continually improving management results by learning from the outcomes of previous policies and practices. The structured incremental adjustment based on modeling and monitoring defines the adaptive part, but the real advance is the management part, working together to solve problems. Shown here is an adaptive management flywheel, which illustrates the adaptive management process. The process begins with the problem definition and the objective, and for this application, the problem definition is excessive nutrient loads to western Lake Erie Basin, and the objective is to reduce the phosphorus loads by 40% to the western Lake Erie. So the next step then is to plan and identify load reduction targets, plan actions to reduce phosphorus loads, and then to assess gaps and develop the adaptive management work plan. Followed by that is to act, so we implement actions to reduce the phosphorus loads. These actions are identified in the recently completed domestic action plans that are available on binational.net. Next, monitoring must be established and continued on a long-term basis from the watershed to the lake. And then to evaluate and learn, modeling of the system results is necessary to predict if the actions will have the desired effect. And if over time the desired results are not being achieved, to improve the models based on fundamental research that increases our understanding of the underlying processes of this very complex system. Learning and then adjusting the actions to reduce phosphorus loads brings us full circle on the flywheel. And here's where we ensure that the models are accurately predicting the ecosystem response and improve them as necessary. So our project focused on assessing the current state of the science of the ecosystem models for use in adaptive management. Our overall goal of the study is to develop a process of using modeling approaches to affect ecosystem management through the adaptive management framework, but was more narrowly to answer the following questions: where are there gaps in modeling from watershed to the lake, and how can models be used in an adaptive management process? The deliverables from this study, which is still ongoing, is an inventory of models to determine their usability in an adaptive management framework, to present a graphical representation of available models in relationship to one another to achieve a whole ecosystem model for assessing and predicting outcomes of management actions in an adaptive management framework, and then to identify the levers in those models that correlate to potential management actions and assess main sources of uncertainty in key variables. And lastly, it's to provide advice on how progress towards phosphorus reduction goals can be measured and communicated in an adaptive management framework. So Dr. Arandides and his team undertook an extensive literature review of watershed models with the emphasis on those applied to western Lake Erie. Shown here is a list of the models, along with a number of documents that were reviewed, and in parentheses, the number that were specific to western Lake Erie. So in all, some 116 articles were surveyed, with 49 that were relevant to western Lake Erie. Next, the model diversity was characterized, as illustrated by this slide. First, we focused on looking at the watershed model diversity, and then second, we looked at the lake. So I'll first talk about the watershed models. So essentially, the models span the characteristics from the SWAP model, which is the Soil and Water Assessment Tool by the USDA, that had more parameters but less calibration points in time and space, to the Sparrow model, which is the spatially referenced regressions on watershed attributes produced by the USGS, that has less parameters but more calibration points in time and space. So the Sparrow model estimates the amount of contaminant transported from inland watersheds to larger water bodies by linking the monitoring data with information on watershed characteristics and contaminant sources. The Sparrow is a simple data-driven model that's not used as a predictive device, but rather as investigative and environmental auditing tool. It's founded upon a time for space strategy aiming to elucidate the export rates of nutrients from different land use types, the fate of fertilizers exported from fields to streams, the total phosphorus budget within a watershed context, hotspots, priority management areas for nutrient export. The current model allows for an increased number of research questions to be addressed, but it should be remembered that this model will only be as good as the available data. The SWAP model is a river basin scale model developed to quantify the impact of land management practices in large, complex watersheds. Hydrologic response units are the smallest spatial unit of the model, which lumps all similar land uses, soils, and slopes within a subwatershed based upon user-defined thresholds. Long-term continuous simulations of the watershed with a daily time step are possible, and then hydrology, sediment, nutrients, pesticides, and bacteria are the outputs. So 5 SWOTs were evaluated based on different calibration periods. There were different sources of fertilizer information amongst these 5 different SWOT models that were reviewed. There were different assumptions for agricultural tile drainage, and only 2 models considered manure applications that may be a main driver of the dissolved phosphorus. So just some of the key findings was that in looking at all of the watershed models, SWOT models were the most popular being applied to this particular problem. The SWOT model for the Maumee watershed performed satisfactory, but its ability to predict phosphorus was determined that it could be improved. The 5 existing SWOT models displayed differences in hydrology and nutrients for the Maumee watershed, and data discrepancies and gaps exist across the models, including the boundary of tile drainage and manure applications that were considered in only 2 of the models. Multi-site calibration is an essential calibration strategy, and that existing SWOT models were less reliable in reproducing the impact of extreme events. Now I'll talk about the Lake Erie models. Next, the diversity of the Lake Erie models are shown here. The models were characterized as either empirical or process-based models and range from less to more complexity and with their number of ecosystem response indicators. Models used in the Lake Erie multi-model approach have a wide range of complexity and the capacity to address the response of various ecosystem indicators to the range of phosphorus loading. The 2 empirical or data-driven models, one that's University of Michigan and IAGLR Western Lake Erie HAB model, and then another produced by NOAA's National Ocean Service Lake Erie model were compared. And then there were 7 mechanistic models shown here: the Central Basin Hypoxia model, the ECO, the ELCOM, CADM, Great Lakes Cladophora model, an in-box model, and a total phosphorus and mass balance model, and a Western Lake Erie ecosystem model. So again, the primary models we looked at from the empirical strategy are shown here, which I already mentioned, those 3. And then the key points that we found from comparing those was that the estimation of internal diffusive fluxes, contribution of phosphorus to the water column, is a key model parameter, and that the temperature and aerobic, anaerobic conditions have a very strong influence with this particular type of model. We then took a closer look at these process-based lake models, as you can see here. So shown here on this slide is the performance of the evaluated lake models that were measured by relative error and model efficiency. As you can see, the relative errors can be quite large for water quality and the biological variables. With respect to model efficiency, a value of 1 corresponds to a model that perfectly predicts the observed values. A value of 0 indicates the model predictions are as accurate as using the mean of the observed data as the prediction. And then a negative value indicates the observed mean as a better predictor than the model. And as you can see from the graph on the right, the values are centered on 0 to less than 0, meaning that model performance was poor for these biological parameters. We then took a closer look at the models, performance just for Lake Erie. And you can see here that other than for temperature, the model performance for Lake Erie is comparable or less satisfactory than the suite of other models we looked at that were more broadly applied. So key findings in looking at the lake models was that the ability to reproduce stratification patterns and thermal dynamics is satisfactory across the model dimensions. The prediction of water quality patterns for offshore appears better than the nearshore, and predicted dissolved oxygen generally matched observed ones, particularly at the bottom layer, but less so at the thermocline. And the complex model structures do not necessarily provide a better fit to the observed data. Performance declines as we move from the physical to the biological models. In addressing model uncertainty, it was determined that Sparrow is an ideal tool for feed-forward coupling with SWOT to constrain uncertainty in the model predictions, and that ensemble modes, either in serial or parallel, can explicitly account for uncertainty inherent in the model selection process. As part of this, upon completion on the review of the extensive amount of literature and a summary that Dr. Aronditis and his team presented, a workshop was held on March 15th and 16th in Ann Arbor, Michigan. In that workshop, we had 4 themes that were addressed. The first session focused on, are the gaps in our current set of models that help inform nutrient management in the Great Lakes? So what are those gaps? Some of the things we discussed in that session are an overview of the core adaptive management questions and examples of how watershed and lake ecosystem models are used to help answer those questions, and where are we flush with models to choose from, but where are there model gaps? In session 2, we looked at the major concerns and the weaknesses in model performance. We looked at an overview of major factors that affect watershed model performance, major factors that affect the lake model performance, and we did the comparative assessment of model performance of both the watershed and lake ecosystem models. In session 3, we focused on what are the results and answers from the recent modeling efforts on Lake Erie. We had presentations on recent modeling efforts to help inform nutrient management efforts in the Lake Erie. We did a comparative assessment of strengths and weaknesses and assumptions of these recent modeling efforts. And we assessed current answers to the core adaptive management questions, such as where do we have consistency in answers, where are the concerns and caveats to these answers, and what questions remain unanswered. And we also asked, can we recommend sets of watershed and lake ecosystem models that can and should be used in an integrated manner to answer specific sets of core adaptive management questions? And then lastly, in session 4, we looked at what would put us on a path to have a robust set of watershed and lake ecosystem models that are regularly updated and used to inform nutrient management in the Great Lakes. We had over 32 regional experts who participated in the workshop and were used to elicit input on a path to having a robust set of watershed and lake ecosystem models. We used an online survey tool that proved quite effective in eliciting and recording opinions amongst those present. The group was able to help formulate the questions that were to be asked, stemming from the outputs from sessions 1 to 3, and to ensure that we were actually asking the right questions. And then responses were anonymous, which ensured full participation by everyone, both from our newest and youngest members in the audience to our most erudite experts. And so shown here on the lower left is one example of a question that we posed and some of the responses. So the question was, in an era of limited resources and desire for quick solutions, what should be the priority focus? And so then ranked in order, the responses shown that number 1 was design adequate monitoring. Second was to establish the institutional framework and the funding streams for a formal nutrient adaptive management committee. Third was invest in basic science to improve understanding of ecosystem processes. Fourth was refine the watershed models. Fifth was to refine the lake models. And then sixth, there were other suggestions that were made. So outputs from this workshop were a list of the most pressing data and knowledge gaps in model performance. We established criteria and identify which models meet those criteria to answer core adaptive management questions on Lake Erie. A list of priorities for addressing model gaps and unanswered adaptive management questions, and an initial framework on how to inform others and address the above priorities. So a report will be forthcoming on the details of the workshop and its findings and on the project as a whole. So our next steps are to identify the levers of the modeling process and model connection that correlates to management actions for evaluation of reciprocal effects of model outputs and management actions, to provide advice to governments through the International Joint Commission on how progress towards phosphorus reduction goals can be measured and communicated in an adaptive management framework, and then to continue to strengthen the connection with Annex 4 as it enters into the adaptive management phase and assist the Annex with identifying the institutional structure to support adaptive management, to provide Research Coordination Committee advice on the science of the adaptive management process, particularly the development of an operational ecosystem model for AM, and a full report that will be provided to the IJC. We'll have several journal publications in a special issue, and a more detailed report will also be available with annexes. So with that, I'd like to entertain any questions you might have. Yes, there's one. It's called the Great Lakes Adaptive Management Committee, and it's under the International Joint Commission's Boards of Control. And I was one of the members who helped design that and establish the institutional framework, and on the U.S. side, set up the funding stream. And I believe now it's been functional for 3 years, I believe. Yeah, going on 3 years, and has been making progress. So. All right, thank you. You let me off easy.
Okay. Let me see. Where did that PowerPoint go?
Jeff, before started
Yeah?
discussion session, they want to do
Oh, yes.
drawing. Yeah.
So the reason why everyone's here is for the draw. Okay, so we leave it past, we've got this draw. So pass it over to you.
Hi. Thanks, Wendy. You're welcome. I just wanted to thank everyone for attending the IJC session, and we're having a little drawing as a little surprise thank you for those who stayed to the end. We're asking that you drop your badge into the box, and then we'll draw out some prizes, and you can come up and make a selection of your gift. We'll try to be quick so that you can go on to the rest of your program.
Good, so this is real live thanks for coming. Now, I would have Wendy wait until we got done where everybody had to contribute to the discussion session, but we'll leave it that you can we'll have our draw. That works really well. I'm all serious. Me too. There you go. Okay. You come up to choose.
Here's another one.
Ooh, I like this.
Yeah.
Look at this guy.
Can you draw the next one?
Nice.
Evie Bronstedt.
Yay, Amy. Nice. Oh, good.
So I will choose the other little fish one. I'm sure that the kids, they were eyeing these all week at the registration. And so I'll ask Dean to pick the last one, or actually there's two, if you'd like. Young Jung, University of Toronto. Oh, here's another one. Well, I will give him a hat. And who would like a 2019 IAGLR membership? You do.
Who would like it? Frank.
Frank. Frank Babacqua.
There you go.
Hope you enjoy prizes.
Hardly. That's way better than the rest of the discussion. Thanks so much, Wendy. That's wonderful. Yeah, thanks, and a nice recognition of all of our efforts to stay. So we thought we'd wrap up with a discussion to help us do our job, and so to do that, we with thanks to Matthew. We have a few slides just to take us through to introduce our final session. We've described, and as Matthew described to start with, the Science Advisory Board is an important element of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes work. The International Joint Commission's Great Lakes contributions are defined in the Water Quality Agreement, as is our role on the Science Advisory Board, very explicitly in Article 7 of the agreement, where we provide advice to the Commission and to the Water Quality, to the Great Lakes Water Quality Board around issues associated with delivery of the Water Quality Agreement itself. We provide advice on scientific matters referred back to us, as was described, and work with the Commission on how that advice would be brought forward, and the rest defines how we're put together. So what we thought we'd do in the next 20 or 40 minutes, depending on how we keep, and because I have no more prizes to give, we thought we'd have a discussion to help us on our way, and I'll introduce a few questions. I'll scan through them, and then we'll jump back and use those to help drive our discussion overall. And we would like your input and thoughts about the role of the International Joint Commission in the science agenda on the Great Lakes. And for those of you in the room that are involved in research, what do you think the role of the Science Advisory Board is in your individual research? We're interested in input on ideas for work plan topics. You've seen in our agenda today a suite of topics that members of the Science Advisory Board have taken on and are taking on and are delivering with consulting help and with the help of the Secretariat. Ideas for other places where this integrative role that we play can be brought forward. And then building on that idea, what are other collaborative opportunities that we could undertake that would increase the relevance of our science advice to governments? So let's just with that little infusion, just open up, and we have a lot of members of the boards and then others in the room. So any thoughts to kick us off on our discussions? Please, Deb. Very nice. Right. So the idea of coming out of the vast array of science that we see at IAGLR, for example, to think about what are those priorities and how can we advance them. That's a great point, Deb. Thanks. Yeah, I agree. Other thoughts on that idea? Please. Sure. Yeah, an interesting idea. So the role of the IAGLR itself as a place for us to intersect with science broadly. Neat idea. Thanks. Yes, please.
There's a way that they could help foster that interaction between the top part of the food web, the bottom part of the food web, and getting a lot of scientists working on a common set of interactions in a modeling framework. It might really help move us forward, because we got some fairly complex questions in nutrient management which are still not resolvable, I think partly because of that schism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting you raise, because the both Debbie's talk and Eve's talk earlier on groundwater came out of what was some thinking about roles of models, roles of the Science Advisory Board and the Research Coordination Committee in helping foster, develop, advance kind of concepts. Same sorts of ideas as a powerful tool. Yeah, a neat point. Yeah, please, Catherine. Sorry, Jeff, apologize.
I'll pass you the microphone after. So to that, but also that interaction and those feedback is so important, I think, to get. And then just to Carol's point, is in my time on the Science Advisory Board, it wasn't always for sure that the IJC was going to have presentations at IAGLR. It's sort of come through different cycles, but in the last, I think since the new board was formulated, there's been a pretty consistent at least presentations and typically at least a session, and I think it continues to be a really good platform to intersect, as said, but to it's the comments like this that you've provided, I think, is very valuable and gets us thinking about it, because as Mike Donahue said in his presentation earlier today, and I think to our credit, the Science Advisory Board is moving from a reactive board to our mandate increasingly becomes more forward-looking, and I think it's only by interacting with the researchers that fosters that forward thinking and the kind of concept of what's the emerging concerns, because really that's the role of researchers.
Because the other point I'm always also aware of is that the computing power needs to be repository somewhere. So what university has that, for example? One of the earlier talks this week was on the North and South Saskatchewan River and how they've used that river basin to put things together. I think for us, the Great Lakes have been so huge. They're tough. They're hard to get enough people together around the different basins, the different lakes together to actually provide that synergy. But if there's some central underpinnings of this kind of a thing, can we use the same model on all 5 lakes, the same ecosystem, type of a structure? Then that's going to solve a lot of problems. So,
So I'll get Catherine first, and then back to you, Scott.
Good afternoon. The Commission has consistently consulted with Indigenous communities across the basin. I would suggest that the Science Advisory Board should move towards integrating, keyword, integrating Indigenous peoples' knowledge, otherwise known as TEC or traditional ecological knowledge, in Great Lakes St. Lawrence science. Jeff Friedel made this same point on Wednesday's International Decade Town Hall. He may want to comment. He pointed to the example of the long-term collaboration between the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois of Akwesasne and his own River Institute in Cornwall. It's overdue. There are impediments to Indigenous people participating, one of which being travel, but certainly they have a part to play, and it's time to step up. Thank you.
Good, thanks, Catherine. That's a great topic for us to build on a bit. We have happily, I think, as you may have pointed to, some useful interaction and integration of Indigenous folks, especially with Henry's input to the Science and Priorities Committee. So we've got some room to go, but lots of distance to go there in terms of making, you know, those strides further, and we'll talk more about that. So back to you, Scott.
Yeah, so I was just reflecting on last week. I was with folks from the Yangtze Fisheries Commission and the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission here, and traveling the Great Lakes. And then I was at an earlier talk yesterday, the African Great Lakes session that was chaired by Bob Heckey, and then reflecting on your talk. And the common theme in all of those is that the science was being driven by the managers in a close interaction. And we have that, right, between the RCC and the SPC, but we all know that serve on those boards that we're always asking for more integration, more and more integration. And I see that in the talks. You could just say, well, Debbie, you could do a little bit more integration with Dave, and we know all of that, right? It's just a matter of pace and time and capacity. I don't know if we can, but that's just an observation of me personally working on the board. It's kind of, how do you get the right pace to truly integrate?
Yeah, so there's the limitation there of actually making it happen versus getting something done and how you pull things all together.
Yeah, and it's not a fault of it, it's just the reality, and I don't know.
Yeah. So Mike and Mike. So.
Thank you. I see the role of the IJC in advancing the science agenda just as I see it when I read the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. They have to make sure that the parties are staying on track. I like seeing the IJC active here at IAGLR because that's where I believe they'll get some interaction with the rest of the public. And I'll just call the scientists as stakeholders public. And so I just don't think it's the IJC that should be advancing the agenda, but open and listening to what the public has to say.
Interesting. And that well, there or there. That's good, Mike.
I think I would echo what Scott just said. There's a real history, and I think the recent history of the boards is very effective in terms of integration. You know, some of these studies, some of which I've been involved in, have articulated a question very well. They've brought together the latest data, literature surveys, you know, workshops, panels of experts to say what is our current understanding of this topic, and there aren't that many venues for that. So the convening power and the integrating goals of the Science Advisory Board are very effective. I think also just the standing presence. There's a number of different Science Advisory Boards that are convened, you know, for a particular purpose, and they write a report and then they're disbanded. So you lose some of that continuity. I think in terms of setting the research agenda, as long as the people that pay for the research are paying attention to it, it's great. If the IJC had, you know, a big pot of money to pass out, they could have much more direct influence on the research agenda. But, you know, we'd all like big pots of money, wouldn't we? So I think that is happening. It's a little bit more indirect than if you were at the National Science Foundation or somewhere else, but maybe one task could be to be a little bit more aggressive about pushing that agenda to the people that do the funding of the research.
Interesting. So we have the role of bringing experts together. Mike here, with role of bringing experts together is one that we definitely hold. An interesting point that the standing nature, that it's extant and continues, is an interesting point. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with John's point. I mean, formally IJC is advising the parties, and so then it's a question of once we put out a report, and even with a letter to the parties, what is there follow-up on that? Are they considering those recommendations and implementing them? And again, maybe it's just a matter, there's nothing to prevent maybe the IJC from some type of follow-up correspondence, even if it's 6 months, a year down the road on, we produce this report, suggest this, science strategy on a particular topic. Is it possible to incorporate that? I know formally too, we weigh in with the Annex 10 process, right? And so that can be another way to be helping to advance the agenda. And then I think maybe as you alluded to, John, just even informally too, once we have a product that's public, it's formally, maybe for the parties, but it's public, it's available for anyone to read, including scientists in the community who can take that on their own and kind of run with it in terms of recommendations in there. And one other thought too in that regard is, sometimes, as we've discussed, we produce peer-reviewed publications out of some of these efforts. And those are more likely, I assume, to be read by, a number in the research community, and then maybe, take those more to heart in terms of research, or science recommendations going forward. So just a few thoughts.
Yeah, good. So the feedback from the parties to us, and we were talking about the drawdown or the directed direction to the science board coming from the commission, but also in that loop where they're getting input from the parties, that would also be helpful for us to understand what their needs are broadly as well, I suppose. And then the part, as you mentioned, then around coming, the way that the information we can draw together does provide a public resource for researchers and others. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, good afternoon. Paul Sibley, University of Guelph. And I just want to follow up briefly on the comment about the First Nations engagement. I think we all understand and appreciate this can at times be a fairly intractable issue because, put it very simply, we operate in very different circles. But, the University of Guelph, my home institution, just announced recently the hiring of 5 Aboriginal positions in various areas, and I know we already have 2 in existence right now that work on issues related to fisheries in the Great Lakes, and it's kind of a 50% association with, for example, Saugeen and Ojibwe First Nations. So I just wonder if there's a mechanism that might be worth considering, whereby we, or the IJC, reach out to the universities and to these faculty, these new people, and I think this is occurring at other institutions as well. Perhaps to serve, if not as members of the Science Advisory Board, but at least as maybe liaisons to the board, so that we can get that greater input there. Because it's the mechanism of getting that engagement, and I appreciate that people like Henry Lickers has been very heavily involved, but is that sufficient? I don't know. So there may be a mechanism here to reach out as universities start to bring on some more of these faculty positions.
Yeah, thanks. So that does provide a new resource or a connection, as you say. A really important idea. Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say something else, but I'll first respond to that comment. So we do have an effort underway to get all our non-Indigenous people from all our various boards together to try to increase our involvement in that. So, but that's something we need to do, and we're moving towards that. But that is something we got underway. The other thing I want to just bring out is about the point of the audience, right? So it's clearly the primary audience is the governments, but as Mike said, there's also the ability to influence the other audiences, right? Mm-hmm. And whether that's the NGOs or academia or the public, right? That there's still a big impact can be made by reaching those other audiences. And even, for instance, when we do press releases, right? That then gets out to the public, and that helps further scientific understanding. So just as projects are developed, to keep in mind that there's a secondary and possibly even a tertiary audience, not just the primary audience. And then back to the point about the value of getting the parties to listen to us, right, and adopt the recommendations made by the SAB, whether it's through the IJC or directly by SAB. I think about in risk assessment, the more successful risk assessments are where you have a good problem formulation phase, where you do your conceptual model and you involve the risk manager in kind of scoping out what the decision is and what the solution will be. So I think back about one of the very successful SAB projects was the one on the indicators, mm-hmm. But it wasn't like we just handed them the report at the end. They were involved and there were several discussions about how the indicators would be used by the parties afterwards. So involving the parties in the discussion, similar to the way you involve the risk manager in a risk assessment up front, would be useful, not just kind of handing it to them at the end. So we need to involve them throughout the continuum of the project.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. Those are great points. The IJC under the Water Quality Agreement has a very formal role in what is that public engagement piece, and that's fueled by both information in and information out, and so it's a key role, as you point out, Vic. And then you're right around that in that place. I think we really do achieve especially under the new Water Quality Agreement, when we tie closely to the annexes and work closely with them, we can really get some important synergies. And then some of us have a schizophrenic role where we're party and here and we believe that we're part of what is this broader community and actually provide some of that conduit as well. Please.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that point too, because I too work in the area of risk assessment, and I have seen probably more instances where there's been a lack of engagement between the risk manager and the risk assessor. So basically, you know, as a scientist, I like the risk assessment side. I provide those numbers, I do the risk characterization, then I hand over my little portfolio to the risk manager, and they go and do their thing. So that engagement often isn't there, but the point I want to make is that there are new, part of it says that something old is new again, but things like translational science, which is a process that only operates because there's that across-the-board engagement from the get-go. And it's a process that's slowly starting to pick up some steam. And in principle, it's not that different from how risk assessment should work, but isn't. And so this is an explicit acknowledgement of that interaction at the problem formulation stage and all the way through the whole process. And if you're not familiar with translational science, there's been a few major thematic articles that have been published in things like Frontiers in Ecological Sciences and so on. That is maybe something that the IJC could also consider adopting as kind of a way of thinking about how doing things. Yeah.
Neat. Yeah, interesting. As was mentioned in the quote that tells us what our job is, that we speak both to the commission itself, but also to the Water Quality Board, which is the policy advice body, sort of thinking about on the management side, bringing agencies together to talk about what are the things what we would do, and then our side, what would be the science we would do that would go to them as clients to help with that piece. So the translational element kind of comes in that dialogue overall. Yeah, good, thanks.
There is a new management engagement venue that's linked with IAGLR that is really just getting started, which is the IAGLR organized or IAGLR sponsored lake meetings on the 5-year cycle. And so that, by design, is intended to engage more of a management audience and put the managers and the scientists in the same room, but at a smaller geographic scale, so that you're going to see a greater representation of them than you would at a meeting like this, where they'd have to sift through the full program to find the little piece that's most relevant to their working. But I would think that continuing to look at that opportunity from the IJC perspective, and then also that's also designed to engage with the various lake area management groups, teams. So the combination of those two, I think, could be very effective if it's kind of intentionally pursued.
Yeah, neat idea. So the upcoming Lake Superior meeting is an example of that, that IAGLR is fostering an important place. And there is another loop that we complete. The RCC and the IJC provide some support at the front end on the planning side of the coordinated monitoring and science initiative, with the same idea of trying to sort of think about how it is we can help facilitate that dialogue, which then feeds to the end and then brings that full loop around. Neat. Good. Other thoughts on roles? We, let's see, roles, science topics, as you thought about the, having been at the conference and thinking then some of the pieces. I think the overarching pieces that we've heard here that really are really relevant, the TEK piece, the role of modeling piece that we have a couple of other ideas in long-term maintenance of modeling, and then this interesting idea about translation of science and translational science efforts as broad categories or principles upon which help drive our future work, perhaps. Other ideas about topic areas come out of our thinking? Michael.
One idea that came up, I think during Q&A a little bit this morning, was on the citizen science issue. And I don't recall now, I should know, but I don't recall in the time I've been on the board if we've ever really taken that on too much as a potential topic to explore. But it seems like it'd be ripe for some, binational consideration, because I know there's more and more going on that individual groups are supporting some, I think some academic groups sometimes, but in particular NGOs and others. And I mean, even EPA, I think, didn't they sponsor like that nutrient sensor challenge? So, I mean, it seems like there are definitely a number of opportunities there, and I think something that, it would also have a number of applications. I think that the IJC would be interested in, both related to, just advancing the science, but even engaging the broader public in Great Lakes issues, because that, you can do that if you got the, younger group that's doing, or whichever groups, but, non-scientists who are getting involved in some of this work and, data collection, whatever, and just learning more about the system and contributing, and potentially, especially the younger generation thinking about, potential careers going forward. So I think it might be a topic worth for the SAB to be, exploring in the near term.
Yeah, how interesting. Yeah. So citizen science as a broad category of things. I don't know of any. I don't know if you guys, Secretariat, know of any such things we've been involved in. It's an interesting idea. Other ideas? Yep, Catherine.
I believe that the Science Advisory Board should really be anticipating the end of the current cycle that we're just beginning and the next triennial report. It was mentioned at the GLEC meeting, you and I discussed this last night, Gavin, that the parties took an annex by annex perspective on their progress, and the IJC took a general objectives perspective on the process. So we had some disconnects in terms of reviewing and the IJC's review of the review. And so certainly I think that it is the role of the Science Advisory Board primarily to get that right well in advance, so that the IJC can anticipate going forward the progress that the party is making and report and review accordingly. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great point and well heard, Catherine. And it's one that all of us involved have spent a bunch of time thinking just about that. And the commission itself very much engaged in the discussion with the parties around the utility of the past tap. The parties also very interested in the next round and how well their progress report is working. So good discussions that go around, but certainly among the boards, us, and then very importantly with the Water Quality Board, in very active dialogue about how, working with the Secretariat, we can best provide input and advice to the Commission on their response to the next progress report. So much in line with your thinking. So I rarely get to say, yes, I'm on it, but that one I can. So that's nice. Good, please.
I have addressed the International Joint Commissioners about a very important topic, that there should be standard methods in sampling for analysis. This is left to the states and PDS permits and so on. They go around it and they underreport the outflows. This is the case of the Detroit wastewater treatment plant, about which I spoke on Tuesday. So what I am urging, that SAB would write a report urging that standard methods of analysis should be used by various contributors to the lakes, rivers, and so on, and that proper sampling would be done. If there is no proper sampling, we have no idea what's going on. At one time, we had transept studies of the Detroit River. They have been discontinued. And the last IJC report showed that the phosphorus rises in the Detroit 10 times. How is it? And this is why we need to have standard methods and right sampling techniques.
Thanks. A real challenge for certain, and it's one that you see underlying a number of the science examinations that we carry out, those challenges. The specific one, I'm not coming to mind on your specific examples. As we know, we work in a multi-jurisdictional environment where there are other drivers that drive the way that samples are done that may be consistent with a state or a province, and those can come to place. But you're exactly right, that provides a science challenge that we're all very interested in. Thank you. Other thoughts? Yeah, please.
Taking us back to earlier discussions, but one of the things I just thought of was what I was trying to get at earlier is, can we have greater continuity? And maybe, so not a science topic per se, but we had the town hall on a decade of science and reinvigoration of science. I think that same type of mantra of, you know, can we have not a decade, but perhaps a 5-year emphasis around a general objective or one of the annexes that allows us to dig deeper and pull together a sequence, a related sequence of projects on a particular topic.
Yeah, so it approaches there. Interesting idea. So, we broadly, you would say, are using a broad portfolio approach, right, covering a range of areas such that we're providing advice across the whole piece, but perhaps an alternative which would be drilling in a bit.
Yeah, and I think what Debbie's set up is ideally suited for that. So,
yeah, good. I've got Mike and Carol.
Let me get in the audience. Is Val Klump out there? Val? No, I'll speak for Val.
Okay,
what
good.
Val would take off on that right away and say we do need a decade, and it should be a decade of exploration and research for fundamental science. This is something that we're coming to the conclusion that there isn't enough student involvement in science. And if you look around the room, our next generation are the young folks that are going to have to take over. Now, we've heard this kind of thing before, but we actually have data from the membership at IAGLR, where it's stayed at about 800 for the past 30 years. There should have been more people getting involved and staying. Are we saying that the population has stayed the same in the Great Lakes Basin? I don't think so. It's increased, and I'm sure we have greater need for science. But to get the science going is support from the parties. They're the ones that drive science.
And I want to clarify, I'm fully supportive of the decade of science.
Yeah.
As I tweeted. What I'm saying is, as part of that should be focused on one topic area, but the SAP perhaps in the portfolio where we want, say if we're working on 3 topic areas,
Oh, mine down in depth. Nice.
Neat. So as we're suggesting, as those of you involved on Wednesday at Val's the session, specifically on a concept that emerges a bit out of our discussion, same thing. How do you tackle this challenge? And that's putting it together in an envelope. And then you hadn't thought about the connection with new scientists. Maybe
Well, yes, it's new science and new ideas, and it's like a regeneration. So
yeah, got it.
Regeneration.
Interesting. Maybe we just need more door prizes.
Yeah, just to follow up on Scott's idea regarding maybe a longer term look at a particular theme that's more, can get greater depth. I agree with that completely. I just, now that we have the triennial assessment, it seems like a 3-year grouping of years would make a lot of sense, so that if we maybe at a 3-year interval of time had a theme area or a topic, and then we report out on that or on several perhaps that of a 3-year topic. I think that would make a lot of sense from my perspective. Another comment that I wanted to make relates to a lot of things I'm hearing here and have been hearing in the past about the fact that while IJC through the Science Advisory Board and other boards can support some research. In terms of the overall research budget that academics and consultants see, the budget is quite small. It's a small drop in the bucket, and so one thing that I think we might consider doing at some point is engaging National Science Foundation program directors, inviting them for a meeting to hear from our Great Lakes experts, maybe National Institutes of Health, NIEHS, folks that have these billion-dollar budgets, some of which is being directed towards Great Lakes research. You know, that may have some merit. Also, NSF and some of these other agencies do partner with other organizations at times to go out for a call for project areas. And so I know that's not the IJC or SAB model, but it's out there to talk about.
Interesting, and importantly, the money part is a big piece of what drives the engine of people's ability to focus. And that idea about leaking out, we've talked a bit about that. It's really an interesting concept to draw the attention and understanding of NSF or NSERC on our side of the border. Great points. Thanks.
You know, it strikes me, Carol, as you're talking, that if there's this 3-year drumbeat to the reporting on the status of the lakes, you know, maybe one of the indicators that should be quantified somehow is the status of the scientific research community. You know, that's done periodically with research vessels, but you know, maybe we could count mass specs, or we could look at the number of PIs, or the collective funding from various sources that's come into that research community. It would be hard to do the first one. It would be easier to update once you had one. But that seems like maybe an obvious thing that I don't know that anyone's done recently. There have been a couple of grand challenges type workshops. There was one a few years ago that turned into a manuscript at Michigan State. There was a partially NSF funded Great Lakes biogeochemistry workshop at Wayne State. So some of these things maybe might make sense for SAB to go back and look at and see, are there ideas here that haven't made it over to IJC. But I think just that, you know, that status of the research enterprise type metric would be interesting.
That's interesting, that idea of taking the idea about priorities and actually asking what are we doing today, kind of to our question around what. Yeah, and very nice. There's strength in that, and we mentioned the research inventory. In its day, conceptually, its early estimates had some of those cost estimates and investments, and so part of it was a sense that we might be able to get at that. It's hard to get full buy-in, as Mark was describing to us, as we think about that inventory. But a neat idea in its total. Please.
So this is a little bit out there, but I think of it actually makes sense and in relevance to, you know, the state of the science and the state of the understanding of IJC. So one of the things I had a pleasure of participating in earlier in the week was a mentoring lunch for students, graduate students, and so basically it was a lunch where you'd be able to provide some feedback on your own experience. And I think they specifically targeted non-academics, so that because the idea that students have access to academics. And one of the things that the IJC could be looking at is working with the IAGLR in partnership to do a youth-oriented and just their own awareness, and even ask some of these same questions to that audience to see what kind of ideas and feedback. And one of the things you gain is then an earlier awareness of the IJC and the role of the IJC with respect to science and with respect to the science agenda in the Great Lakes.
Yeah, it's neat. That's really an interesting idea, and having I know in my graduate career narrowed down on trying to get that thesis done on that individual topic. Well, the idea of turning folks around and having them look out and see the opportunity for the way we draw synergies, the way we see them emerge now in this environment. That's a very neat idea. Cool. Well, we've crossed our 3 o'clock point. I'd want to mention if folks want to go and catch that other last talk, and that was sort of the point at which we'd end. We can certainly stay and chat for a bit longer. Sense of the group. Maybe this feels like a time we could wrap it up. I'd like to thank you all again very, very much. I want to offer my really sincere thanks to the secretaries, especially Matthew, Lee, Vic, and all who helped us out with this process. That was just essential to driving us along. It is like herding cats, and as always, they did a very nice job in getting us to a product that was really useful. So I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate everyone who's been involved, and look forward to communicating more. You can find the work of the boards and all the boards and the IJC on their website, which is a rich place to go and find out what's going on today, and invite you all to participate in their activities as they go along. So thanks very much, everyone.